Hey, first I want to give a big shout out and a thank you to our friends at Newtforce, Kyle Barker, the inventor of this incredible device. It's been a game changer for us. So I just wanted to give you sort of a walkthrough of some of the essentials, the things that we get out of it. If you don't know anything about Newtforce, it's a remarkable tool. One of the problems with force plates is that you have to land directly on the plate to get a good reading. Otherwise, you have to scrub all the data. Well, they solved that problem. They integrated a bunch of pressure sensors and made the entire mound into one force plate. So it gives us ground reaction force data, and it's linked with real-time video. And so we were fortunate to be given one of the very first ones, and Kyle asked us to kind of figure out what it all meant. And so it was really valuable we got some pretty unique insights into it that have transformed our training through the years. And so I just wanted to share some of those with you, okay? First of all, just to orient you, it comes with a graph, okay? And it's linked to real-time video. We'll show you that here in a minute. But also, you have force and you have time. And so the green line here represents force into the ground. That's how hard you're pushing straight into the ground. That's called Z force. The red line is the forward and back force. That's called Y force. So when you push backwards towards second base, that line's going to be positive of the zero line here. And then when you stop your forward momentum with your lead leg, it's going to be negative of the zero line. And the blue line is the side-to-side force. That's called X force. So as I mentioned, we had one of the first units, and we were trying to figure out what it all meant. So what we did is we named 22 data points on the graph that we thought would be important. And then we had 500 pitchers come through here. We had thousands of pitches. And we had the 22 data points and the radar gun on every pitch for thousands of pitches. Now, we collected all the data, and then the first thing we had to do was run a statistical test to see were there any linear relationships in this data, that is, cause and effect or correlation. And the answer was no, and that makes sense because the body's a complex system, and you'll rarely find linear relationships in complex systems. And so next thing we had to do was we had to go to a machine learning algorithm called XGBoost. I like to say this was 2019, so we were AI before AI was cool, okay? We ran this machine learning algorithm to let us rank the variables relative to their influence on velocity. When we were able to rank all the variables, what we came up with was that the number one influence of velocity on our study was weight. Mass was equal to gas, as you might imagine, but only up to about 180 pounds. Once you got past 180, it didn't matter whether you weighed 220 or 210. It wasn't any better. You didn't gain a lot. So what it meant was you had to apparently be big enough. Now, we have to also caveat it with the fact that we had older guys and younger guys in our study. So while the older guys would weigh more, they might also be more skilled. So you have to take that into consideration when you look at that data point. Now, from the graph, from the force metric standpoint, the number one influence of velocity in our study was this measure called impulse, which is the area under this curve right here. And it's measuring how hard you're pushing towards second base multiplied by how long you hold that force, okay? So let's say you pushed back at 100 pounds and held it for a half second. Your impulse will be 100 times 0.5. That would be 50. And so that became really important. The number two influencer was player velocity. That means how fast are you moving down the mound. And the third one is called clawback, or how well do you hit the brakes, okay? So let's just take a look at impulse first, okay? Again, measuring how hard you push backwards multiplied by how long you hold it. So we thought, well, how do we make that number better? Well, it's measuring how hard we push, so let's do what some people teach, and we'll push harder. Unfortunately, when you push harder, you lose time, and the graph spikes. And it would be like taking a fat glass of water, pour it into a tall glass of water. You really don't gain anything. The way you make it better is you hold the force longer. You hold rearward force longer and make the graph wider. So we started looking at that. How do we make that happen? Well, fortunately, as I mentioned, it comes with video. And so what we noticed is that as we're riding along and as impulse is climbing, the pelvis is tilted and parallel to the shoulders. And then as soon as the pelvis goes flat to the horizon, impulse crashes. And it was like this on nearly every guy. And so here's another example of maybe a little better performance in holding that pelvis tilted. And so you can see here pelvis is tilted, and then impulse is climbing, and then it levels off because the pelvis is remaining tilted and parallel to the shoulders. And so the game became, okay, we have to figure out how do we keep the pelvis tilted longer. So we started experimenting with ways to tilt the pelvis, and everything we did to try to tilt the pelvis actually caused it to go flat. The only thing that kept it tilted was an isometric hinge on the back leg. So what we had to do is we had to get into the hinge as they teach in the gym, butt behind the heel, knee not forward of the toe, and that allowed us to tilt the pelvis. The gluteus medius and minimus would grab the pelvis and crank it up and hold. And so we talked about that. We wrote about it. It kind of went across the globe. Everybody started talking about the hinge, the hinge, the hinge, the hinge. But we quickly realized that you can assume the position of a hinge as they teach in the gym, butt behind the heel, knees not forward of the toes. And you can never turn on the hip flexors, the muscles in the front of the hip. And we don't want any of these muscles on a coffee break. And so what we realized that in our world, the hinge isn't about the position as they teach in the gym. It's about the condition known as isometric co-contraction. I mean, muscles are on in an isometric state and holding, and co-contraction means all the muscles around the area are on and holding. So we have to turn every muscle on. Now that's not something we can measure, but we can see it on the graph, okay? Number 2 influencer of velocity was player velocity, how fast you're moving down the mound. So here we're measuring from the peak back leg Z to the peak front leg Z, and we're seeing how fast you go. Now, it gives us a number. Our guys usually, our big leaguers will move about 5.5 miles an hour. Our amateurs maybe 4.5. And so we had to figure out how do we teach them to move faster down the mound. But think about what we just said. We have to hold rearward force as long as we can while also moving fast down the mound as quickly as we can. That seems impossible until you consider the fact that you can only achieve it with isometrics. You have to be able to get into the isometric hinge, hold it as long as you can, and keep the pelvis tilted for as long as you can, not with an unnatural false tilt, but by hinging the hip and turning all the muscles into a co-contraction. And so far, no one we've seen has held it for too long. And so that's player velocity, how fast you move down the mound. And now, the next is what we call clawback, or how well you hit the brakes. Some people call this lead leg block, kind of a misnomer, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But it's the area here. It's how quickly you need to get back to the 0 line, okay? So we don't want to get back too fast. If we get back too fast, it means we've just got a passive knee extension, and we didn't stop the pelvis from spinning. It's about stopping the hip, stopping the pelvis from spinning, and then while holding tension, stopping the knee. And so if it's too steep, it means it was sort of just passive. If you don't brace with the front leg, it just kind of trickles off, okay? And so it's the area that we call lead leg impulse that we're looking for, and the shape really matters, okay? So how do we do that? Well, when the front foot hits the ground, the IT band goes from the tensor fasciae lata and the gluteus maximus here and runs down the side of the leg and attaches here on the tibia. And it crosses a fulcrum right here at the knee, the condyle of the femur right here. So when you land with your knee slightly bent and you co-contract the muscles of the hip, as you rotate, you stop your pelvis from spinning. Stop it from spinning in the transverse plane. And then on the back leg, when you get into here what we call a hip lock, you also co-contract the tensor fasciae lata and the gluteus maximus, and it creates these opposing tension wires, one in the back, one in the front, and allows us to stop the pelvis from spinning so we can rotate and release the ball out in front in authentic extension. If the pelvis doesn't stop, we get linear with our deceleration pattern and we spin off, okay? So how well you stop with the front leg depends on bracing against that IT band on the lead leg, and that gives us that impulse on the front leg. Some other noteworthy metrics that we've been able to kind of gather over the years is one, our impulse, the average guy, most guys are around 25%, okay? If it's less than that, then we know we have to work on creating more force and getting a better impulse, about 25% of their body weight. The back leg Z tends to be about 130% of the body weight, so as you press down into the ground. The back leg Y, how hard you push back towards second base, tends to be about 60% of the athlete's body weight. The lead leg Y here, as you brace on the front leg, tends to be about 120% of the body weight. And the lead leg Z, when you land, is about 200% of the body weight. So we look for those kind of general metrics to see if we can then get an indication to maybe look under the hood and see why an athlete might not be achieving those numbers, okay? But it's important to note that amplitude or size isn't everything here. It's the shape that really matters, and what we've learned over the years is that each athlete has their own signature, and you can kind of see when they're performing their best, what does their graph look like. There's some clear things that we have to fix in the beginning, but eventually everybody kind of gets their own signature. And so it's not really the amplitude, it's often the shape of the graph that matters the most, okay? Now, recently we come up with a new development that we're kind of working on to try to validate whether it's actual or not, but we call this impulse ratio. And basically, it's a representation of the back leg impulse compared to the lead leg impulse. So you take the back leg impulse, which again is pushing backwards and how long you hold it, and then you divide it by the lead leg impulse, the area under the curve here. And basically what we're seeing in initial view is that If it's greater than 1.4, if that ratio is greater than 1.4, we need to work on the front leg, the brakes. If it's less than 1.4, we probably need to work on the engine, the back leg. Now we're still working on that. So that's some emerging data that we're kind of trying to check out, but that's at least a good idea of what we can look at. And now, beyond just the ground force metrics, we're also able, using our TrackMan data, to identify some ball flight influences. Okay, so when we link this to TrackMan, we get this. So we want to release the ball around peak Y as soon as when your front leg is pulling back as hard as it can. And so what we see is that when we release right at peak Y, the ball tends to be, you tend to be right behind the ball. If you release a little bit before the peak Y, you tend to see the ball run to the arm side. And then if you release after, the ball cuts. And so we use this when we're working on pitch shaping, pitch design, because if we get a guy who has a mismatch, let's say he's releasing it before peak Y, which means it should be running, and it turns out to be cutting or sweeping, then that means that maybe he's trying to manipulate the ball with his hand and not letting the grip do the work, which might not be the safest route to go. And so maybe that's not a particularly good fit for that guy to throw that pitch at this time until we can change the way he moves. Now, really important is that all the things that we've ever studied that help you throw harder with regard to ground force data also help improve your command and keep your arm safe and healthy, okay? So this front leg impulse is critical for arm health, okay? Because what we see is that if you when your front leg lands, you just snap into a passive knee extension, that IT band slips forward of the femoral condyle, and then it can't act as the strut to stop your pelvis from spinning. You spin off this way, and the only way to get the ball to home plate is with a dangerous linear deceleration pattern, a big bang on the elbow there, okay? If we stop the pelvis, we can rotate through and get a more rotational deceleration pattern. And so if it's too steep, that means we probably spun off because we kind of just did this sort of false block. If it's too long, if it takes too long to get back or too wide, that means we kind of dump the knee dragged forward, we dump the pelvis forward, and we still result in a linear deceleration pattern that puts the arm at risk. And so really healthy arms tend to have a certain signature as well. And then lastly is command or adjustability, okay? So this impulse isn't only about velocity, it's also critical for adjustability. Remember, we can't repeat the movement. And so the key is being able to make adjustments and adaptations to get the ball to a consistent release point so we can command the baseball better and get a consistent outcome. Using variable delivery patterns, but getting to a consistent outcome. Now, when we see a guy with a good fat impulse, a long, wide impulse, meaning that the pelvis is staying tilted a little longer, that tells us that he was able to hold the pelvis tilted longer and give himself solution space so that then he can make the necessary adaptations to get the ball to that critical authentic extension release point. We see this in hitters. If we see a hitter who doesn't hinge and tilt the pelvis remains flat, that guy has no way to adapt or adjust to any pitch velocity or shape or location, and that guy just has to guess at pitches. It's the same in pitching. When we don't get a quality impulse, then what we start with is what we get, and we spray the ball over the place. If we can hold our pelvis tilted, not only do we throw harder, not only are we more healthy, but we throw with better command because we give ourselves time to make the necessary adjustments to get to a consistent release point. So this Newtforce has been remarkable for velocity, for command, for arm health, everything. It's a wonderful tool. If you haven't seen it yet, feel free to give us a call or call our friends at Newtforce. It's an amazing tool. We're proud to have it. We're thrilled with our relationship with the people at Newtforce, and we're really grateful to have that device because it's been an invaluable tool. But really, its greatest value is probably not as an assessment tool, but as a teaching tool. We can get a guy on the mound and see if we can use maybe med ball work or something like that, or aqua ball work, to recreate the shapes that we want, learn the things like controlling the hinge or the back leg, and we can then immediately get feedback to see, is this the kind of signature that we're looking to create? And so during our bullpens, we can not only just use it as an assessment tool, but as a teaching tool, which makes it really invaluable for us. So big fan of Newtforce. Thanks a lot, Kyle. Appreciate you guys. Have a great day.